Um, so already we've got a bit of a glimpse of some of the symptoms of having inadequate housing and market failure in the housing market. And so I'm not going to try to prove that to you, but instead, because the title of this day is "If Capitalism Doesn't Work, What Does?" So I work sometimes with the Coalition of Progressive Electors, and we put together a team of researchers to look around the world at other cities where they have different ways of running their housing market. So I'm just going to quickly tell you about some of those cities. So this report that I'm going to give you the executive summary of was written by Naomi McCormick and Mina Alievsky, two young researchers, and I was an editor with them. So, like I said, the goal of the report was to look at cities around the world that face similar crises and are comparable to Vancouver in some ways, whether it's high housing prices because of a tight housing market, or constrained geography, or constrained jurisdiction issues, but cities that kind of took control of their housing situation using housing agencies, housing authorities, and other large-scale initiatives like that. So 5 cities I'll talk quickly about are in North America: New York City and Toronto, in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, and then in Europe, Stockholm and Sweden, and Vienna is another one we can talk about later. There are other cities, but these are just some interesting ones to look at. New York City has, it's larger than Vancouver, but it's geographically similar in terms of its housing prices and its geography. And its housing authority is a long-standing, strong one. It has 400,000 residents living in New York City housing. And our analysis, including some recent books like by Nick Bloom in New York, has shown that New York City's housing authority has been rather successful where other high-density housing developments and authorities in the United States were not as successful. And there's famous situations like in Cincinnati and other places where public housing went into disrepair. But in New York City, the housing authority remains very strong and is growing. And the way that it's been able to do that is to maintain high quality of housing and to make sure that the amenities and the building maintenance are superior to that often in the private rental market. So housing authority flats are maintained better than private rental accommodations in general, and they have superior amenities. They're also close to good transportation, and they're developed near transportation on purpose. And there's significant investment in frontline staff, not just for maintenance of the physical property, but assistance in terms of safety and helping people with employment opportunities. Interestingly, the Housing Authority mandates that 50% of tenants are working families and 50% are not, which is a little different than Toronto. So that's something, when we're establishing some kind of central authority, it's important to think about the screening process. So anyway, all these things together in New York acts quality of housing, attractiveness of location, proximity to transportation, the city center, not on the margins of the city. Those have made it attractive, and so the public housing remains in good shape and is expected to last for a long time. In Toronto, it's the second most unaffordable city in the country after Vancouver, and Toronto community housing houses about 160,000 residents. It's hard to compare that to Vancouver because Vancouver does not have a significant centralized housing authority. It has Vancouver Public Housing Corporation, which has 5 buildings and a few hundred residents. And then, of course, the rest are scattered through BC Housing and Metro Vancouver Housing and then nonprofits. But in Toronto, under Toronto Community Housing, they have 160,000 tenants. They have suffered some management problems and things like that recently if you Google it. But in general, the things that we can really learn from Toronto are that it really services people who need housing. So it's housing for people who need it. And some interesting stats are 58% of households are headed by single mothers, 20% by new Canadians, and demographics like that. So you got 160,000 people living in housing for people who need it. Also, there are structures in place to ensure tenant participation there on the board, in terms of participatory budgeting inside each building to ensure maintenance and things like that. So then when we move away from North America, we get some other models that are maybe more impressive. So just quickly, if you have questions, we can get into the details later. Singapore, although has a very different model of government, and I don't recommend their party system, has, again, it's an island metropolis in the Pacific. It has 83% public housing. It's achieved through government-run housing development board, and it manages the housing market. Only 10% of housing is built by the private real estate industry, and that services the rich and the very rich. And the Housing Development Board is able to manage housing inflation and housing costs, and they're very conscious of the way that private real estate industries in other cities manage housing prices and act as a private monopoly to inflate prices, which is obvious to some of us working here, but it's more widely understood there. Hong Kong, I think, is one of the best places to look at because it's our sister city in many ways, and has high housing prices in the private rental market, just like here. However, 48% of Hong Kong residents live in housing authority associated flats. So when you hear it's expensive there, they're talking about the 50% of the market that's private, not the 48% that's not. And the way they've done that is they established housing authority to deal with the crisis that they had, of course, with the migration waves from mainland China 40 years ago. But anyway, 30% are government-owned flats that are rented out at a low rate. 17% are subsidized government housing authority flats. And the way that they pay for a lot of this is, although you'd think that the powers are different than Vancouver, a lot of their funding mechanisms are not that different from what the city of Vancouver could do. Density bonusing is one of the main things that they have because they have high housing prices in the private market. They can lease land to private developers, and they use the money to build massive developments of public housing. And they also are starting to tax commercial land, commercial real estate very heavily along transit lines. And finally, Stockholm, Sweden is interesting. Stockholm is similar because it's a very similar size to Vancouver. It has less than 1 million people in the city proper, 2 million in the region, so it's very similar. But again, the difference is that 30% of residents live in public rental housing. That was made possible because of a massive investment in public housing 30 years ago, in part, where the government built 1 million units of public housing or publicly owned flats across Sweden. But it's really good to look at the way that they manage that now. It's all been downloaded to the municipalities. So, for example, Stockholm manages its housing through its central housing authority, and right now it's a net surplus, so they make lots of money from their renting out those flats because they're all paid off, and it's managed centrally at the city level. So if you're thinking about municipal socialism, at least the way that it's run and managed right now is done at the city level through powers delegated from the government. So those are some cities. Vienna is another one that I won't talk about today, but there's going to be some forums in a couple of weeks about the way that Vienna operates its housing, because the director is coming to Vancouver for a tour, and they have 60% public housing in Vienna. So I just want to say that maybe to end on a philosophical note, the name of this event is if capitalism doesn't work, what does? And two things. One, what we have in Vancouver is not solving, it's not enough. And it's the very least we can do to look around the world at other cities and to be able to learn from what they're doing and translate the best of what they're doing here. Because we don't even need that much of imagination to do that. It takes a little bit of imagination to translate it here and tweak it a little bit so that it fits in this context, but not that much. So it's pretty much the least you could do is use these solutions. Second thing is that we can also try to do things that other places aren't doing. So we could be more imaginative.
Tristan Markle is challenging us to be more imaginative. And now Polling.ca offers you precisely that opportunity to post your own initiative or to vote for an already existing initiative. Choose provincial governments, Minister of Housing, Social Housing, and here you have a poll on how to administer housing. Remember, participation is the essence of direct democracy.